The streets of New York City buzzed with the usual holiday chaos. Brightly lit storefronts displayed their elaborate decorations, and the faint sound of carolers echoed from a distant corner. Nick Whitmore walked briskly, hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his expensive wool coat. He had no destination in mind. He only wanted to escape the suffocating emptiness of his penthouse. The festive season had a way of amplifying his solitude, reminding him of everything he'd lost or never truly had. Nick was a man of contradictions. His name adorned buildings, his fortune ranked him among the wealthiest in the city, yet his life felt hollow. Once married, he dreamed of building a family, but his relentless ambition had driven a wedge between him and his wife. Their divorce 5 years ago had left him adrift, and he'd buried himself in work to numb the ache. As he turned a corner, Nick's gaze fell on a small figure huddled near the entrance of a shuttered cafe. A little girl, perhaps no older than 7, sat on a makeshift cardboard seat, her thin coat doing little to protect her from the biting cold. Her cheeks were flushed from the wind, and her big, expressive eyes followed the bustling crowd with a mixture of wonder and longing. Nick slowed his pace, something about her small frame tugging at a part of him he'd long since ignored. "Hi there," Nick said softly, crouching down to her level. "Aren't you cold out here?" The girl tilted her head, studying him with a surprising confidence for someone so young. "A little, but I'm waiting for my mom. She'll be back soon." Nick frowned. "You shouldn't be out here alone. It's freezing." He shrugged off his coat and draped it gently over her shoulders. "Where is your mom?" The girl's lips curved into a shy smile as she clutched the oversized coat around her. "She's finding food. She says we're gonna have a feast tonight. It's Christmas Eve, you know." Nick's chest tightened. "What's your name?" "Emma," she replied, her voice as soft as the falling snow. Before he could say more, Emma's eyes lit up. "Hey, mister, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She leaned closer, her tiny hands gripping the edges of his coat. "Would you like to be my daddy for Christmas?" The question caught Nick completely off guard. He blinked, unsure of how to respond. Emma looked at him earnestly, as if she truly believed he could grant her that wish. "Your daddy?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded. "I never had one, but you seem nice. And you gave me your coat." Before Nick could find the words to answer, a woman's voice interrupted them. "Emma, what are you doing?" Nick turned to see a young woman approaching hurriedly, her expression a mix of relief and worry. She was bundled in layers of mismatched clothing, her face pale from the cold but strikingly familiar. Nick felt his breath catch in his throat as recognition dawned. "Grace?" he murmured, barely believing his eyes. The woman froze, her wide eyes locking onto his. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as the past came rushing back. Grace was the woman he'd loved years ago, the one who had vanished without explanation, leaving him heartbroken and confused. And now, here she was, standing before him with a child who had just asked if he'd be her father. Grace quickly composed herself, her protective instincts kicking in. "Emma, step away from him," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. Emma hesitated, glancing between Nick and her mother. "But Mom, he's nice. He gave me his coat." Grace's gaze softened briefly as she noticed the coat enveloping her daughter, but her eyes hardened again when they met Nick's. "Thank you for helping her," she said curtly, taking Emma's hand. "We should go." Nick stood, his mind racing. "Wait," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "Grace, is this your daughter?" Grace's grip on Emma tightened, and she avoided his gaze.
"Yes."
Nick stared at them, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. Emma's features, her eyes, her small nose, bore a striking resemblance to someone he knew all too well. "Grace," he began, his voice trembling. Is she mine?" Grace stiffened, her jaw clenching. She glanced down at Emma, who was watching them curiously, then back at Nick. "This isn't the time or place for this," she said firmly. "We have to go." Nick stepped closer, his desperation evident. "Grace, please. I need to know." Grace hesitated, her internal struggle visible. Finally, she shook her head. Let it go, Nick. We don't need anything from you." With that, she pulled Emma gently but firmly away, disappearing into the crowd. Nick stood there, his coat still draped over Emma's small shoulders as they vanished from sight. The world around him seemed to blur, the holiday cheer fading into the background. A million questions swirled in his mind, but one stood out above the rest. Was Emma his daughter? And if so, why had Grace kept her a secret all these years? He turned and began to follow them, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope, anger, and an undeniable sense of purpose. For the first time in years, Nick felt alive. Nick hurried through the crowded streets, his eyes scanning for any sign of Grace and Emma. His mind raced with unanswered questions, and his heart pounded with an urgency he couldn't ignore. He had to find them, had to understand why Grace had disappeared all those years ago, and whether Emma was truly his daughter. The thought brought a strange mix of emotions. Hope, anger, confusion. Could it be possible that he had a child all this time and never knew? The possibility gnawed at him, driving him forward. The city's holiday cheer seemed to mock him now, the twinkling lights and laughter clashing with the storm building inside him. After what felt like an eternity, he spotted them near a small park. Grace was speaking to a man holding a bag of groceries, her body language tense and defensive. Emma stood a few steps away, kicking at a patch of snow. Nick hesitated, not wanting to startle them, but the weight of his questions propelled him forward. "Grace," he called, his voice cutting through the cold air. She turned sharply, her expression hardening when she saw him. "Nick, I told you to let it go." "I can't," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I deserve answers." Grace sighed heavily, glancing at Emma before motioning for the man to take the groceries and leave. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Nick and Grace, but eventually nodded and walked away. Emma looked up at her mother. "Who is he, Mom? Why does he keep following us?" Grace knelt down and placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "Go play for a little while, sweetheart. Stay where I can see you." Emma hesitated, her gaze flickering to Nick before she nodded and trudged toward a nearby bench. Grace straightened and crossed her arms, her posture rigid. "What do you want, Nick?" "I want to know the truth," he said, his voice steady. "Is Emma my daughter?" Grace's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Nick thought she might deny it. But then she sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of whatever she was carrying. "Yes," she said quietly. "She's your daughter." The confirmation hit Nick like a tidal wave, overwhelming him with emotions he couldn't even begin to untangle. He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you leave?" Grace looked away, her expression conflicted. "It's not as simple as you think." "Then explain it to me," Nick pleaded. "I deserve to know why you kept my daughter from me." Grace hesitated, then gestured toward a nearby bench. "Fine, but not here. Let's go somewhere quiet." They walked in silence to a small diner on the edge of the park. Inside, the warmth of the room contrasted with the cold tension between them. Grace ordered a coffee while Nick sat across from her, his hands folded tightly in front of him. "I didn't leave because I wanted to," Grace began, her voice low. "I left because I had no choice." Nick frowned. "What are you talking about?" Grace stirred her coffee absently, her gaze distant. "Your family didn't approve of me, Nick. Your father, especially. He made it very clear that I wasn't good enough for you. And when he found out I was pregnant," she paused, her voice breaking slightly, "he threatened me, said if I didn't disappear, he'd ruin my life, and Emma's too." Nick's stomach churned as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. His father had always been a domineering presence, controlling every aspect of Nick's life. But this was something else entirely. "I didn't know," Nick said softly, his voice filled with regret. "Grace, I swear, I had no idea." "I believe you," she said, meeting his gaze for the first time. "But it doesn't change what happened. I had to protect Emma, so I left." Nick leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. "You could have come to me," he said quietly. "I would have helped you." Grace shook her head. "I couldn't take that risk. Not with your father watching my every move." They sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of the situation hanging between them. Finally, Nick spoke. "I want to be a part of her life, Grace. I've missed so much already. Please, let me make it right." Grace hesitated, her protective instincts warring with the vulnerability she saw in his eyes. "Emma doesn't know who you are," she said cautiously. "This is all new to her. To me, we need time." Nick nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I'll give you time," he said, "but I won't walk away. Not again." Over the next few days, Nick found ways to quietly integrate himself into their lives. He took Emma to the park, helped her with little errands, and even brought her a pair of gloves when he noticed hers were too small. Grace watched warily at first, but she couldn't deny the joy she saw in Emma whenever Nick was around. One evening, as they walked through a neighborhood lit with Christmas decorations, Emma slipped her small hand into Nick's. He looked down, surprised, and saw her smiling up at him. "You're really nice," she said simply. "I like you." Nick's chest tightened with emotion, and he squeezed her hand gently. "I like you too, Emma." Grace walked a few steps behind them, her expression unreadable. But as she watched Nick and Emma together, a flicker of hope stirred in her heart. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for them to be a family after all. The snow began to fall softly around them, and for the first time in years, Nick felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Over the next few weeks, Nick made a concerted effort to be present in Grace and Emma's lives, carefully balancing his enthusiasm with Grace's clear caution. He understood her hesitation. After all, he was a stranger to Emma, despite being her father, and Grace had every reason to protect her. But with each passing day, the walls Grace had built around her heart began to show cracks. Nick's approach was subtle but sincere. He showed up with small gestures that demonstrated his willingness to help without overwhelming them. One afternoon, when Grace mentioned offhandedly that Emma loved books, Nick returned the next day with a small stack of classic children's stories. He watched as Emma's eyes lit up, her little hands eagerly flipping through the pages. Grace didn't say much, but Nick caught the faint smile that lingered on her lips as Emma hugged the books tightly. Despite the slow progress, the weight of their shared history lingered between him and Grace. She remained guarded, and Nick knew she hadn't yet forgiven him. Not entirely. He wasn't sure she ever would. But he was determined to prove to her that he had changed, that he was no longer the man consumed by ambition and blind to the forces manipulating his life. One chilly evening, Nick invited them to visit a holiday market. Emma, bundled in her oversized coat, practically skipped with excitement as she darted from stall to stall, marveling at the handmade ornaments and sweet-smelling treats. Grace followed closely, her eyes flicking back to Nick occasionally, as if measuring his intentions. When Emma begged for a caramel apple, Nick bought her two, laughing as she tried to decide which one to eat first. As the evening went on, the three of them settled on a bench near a brightly lit Christmas tree. Emma, exhausted but happy, leaned against Grace, munching on her treat. Nick took the opportunity to speak to Grace quietly. "Thank you for letting me spend time with her," he said. "It means more than you know." Grace glanced at him, her expression softening just slightly. "She likes you," she admitted, "and you've been good to her." "I can see that." Nick nodded, his gaze fixed on Emma. "I just want to make up for lost time. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be here for her now." Grace hesitated, then said, "It's not just about Emma, Nick. It's about trust. You weren't the only one who lost something when I left." Nick turned to her, guilt and longing etched on his face. "I know," he said quietly, "and I want to earn your trust again. Both of you." Grace didn't reply, but the tension between them seemed to ease just a little. The following morning, Nick received a surprise visit from his longtime housekeeper, Martha. She had worked for his family for decades, long enough to know both his triumphs and his failures. When she heard about Grace and Emma, her reaction was a mix of relief and quiet anger. "I always knew there was something wrong about how she disappeared," Martha said, sitting across from Nick in his elegant but sterile living room. "Your father was a hard man, Nick. He wouldn't have wanted anything, or anyone, interfering with his plans for you." Nick rubbed his temples, the enormity of the situation weighing heavily on him. "I just wish I'd seen it sooner. I could have stopped him. You were young, Martha said gently, and he was very good at controlling everything around him. But you have a chance to make things right now. Nick nodded, his resolve strengthening. I need to do more than just show up. I need to prove to Grace that I'm not my father, that I won't make the same mistakes. As the days turned into weeks, Nick's bond with Emma deepened. They spent afternoons building snowmen, reading stories by the fire, and decorating a small Christmas tree in the corner of Grace's modest apartment. Emma's laughter became a constant source of joy for Nick, a reminder of everything he'd been missing. Grace, however, remained cautious. Though she couldn't deny the positive impact Nick was having on Emma, she still struggled to let go of the pain and fear that had defined her life for so long. But one night, as she watched Nick help Emma hang a delicate ornament on the tree, something inside her began to shift. I've never seen her this happy, Grace admitted quietly, standing beside Martha in the kitchen as they prepared dinner. Martha, who had taken to visiting Grace and Emma regularly, smiled knowingly. Nick's trying, Grace. He's not perfect, but he loves her. And he loves you too. Grace stiffened, her instinct to deny the suggestion rising immediately. But before she could speak, Martha placed a hand on her arm. Sometimes, Martha said gently, letting someone in is the hardest part. But it's also the most important. Later that night, as the snow fell softly outside, Grace found herself sitting beside Nick on the couch while Emma dozed on a pile of blankets. For the first time in years, the silence between them felt comfortable, even peaceful. I never thought I'd see you again, Grace admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Nick looked at her, his expression a mixture of regret and hope. Neither did I. But now that I have, I'm not going anywhere. Grace didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. For Nick, it was a start, and for Grace, it was the first step towards something she'd almost forgotten how to believe in, the promise of a second chance. Nick awoke early the next morning, the pale winter sun casting a faint glow through the frost-covered windows of Grace's apartment. He stretched quietly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful silence that had settled over the small home. For the first time in years, he felt grounded, as though he were finally where he was meant to be. Emma's giggles from the night before echoed in his memory, a melody of innocence and joy that warmed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Grace entered the room, her movements careful and deliberate. She carried 2 steaming mugs of coffee, one of which she set down in front of him. Without speaking, she sat across from him at the tiny kitchen table, her hands wrapped around her own cup. Nick took a sip, letting the warmth spread through him, and waited for her to speak. I've been thinking about us, Grace said finally, her voice steady but low. About Emma. About how different things might have been if your father hadn't interfered. Nick's chest tightened. He'd spent countless nights replaying those what-ifs in his mind since learning the truth, each possibility cutting deeper than the last. We can't change the past, he said gently, setting his cup down. But we can decide what comes next. Grace nodded slowly, her gaze distant. Emma loves you, you know. She doesn't say it outright, but I can see it in the way she looks at you. She's always been such a cautious child, but with you. Her words trailed off, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her face. Nick leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. I love her too, Grace. More than I thought was possible. And I love you. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang between them. I want to be here. For her. For you. For us. Whatever that looks like. Grace's eyes filled with unshed tears, and for a moment, Nick feared she might pull away again. But then she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. I want to believe you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I really do. Their tentative peace was interrupted by the sound of Emma's small feet padding into the room. She rubbed her eyes sleepily and climbed onto Nick's lap without hesitation, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck. Good morning, she mumbled, her voice muffled against his chest. Nick held her close, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and protectiveness. Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well? Emma nodded, then looked up at him with a smile. Can we make pancakes? Grace chuckled softly, the tension easing from her shoulders as she rose to grab the pancake mix. "You're lucky he's here, kiddo," she teased. "I'm terrible at making pancakes." The three of them worked together in the small kitchen, their laughter mingling with the crackling of the stove. Emma insisted on adding extra chocolate chips, and Nick couldn't say no, even as Grace playfully scolded him for spoiling her. By the time they sat down to eat, the atmosphere in the apartment felt lighter, almost like a glimpse of the family they might become. But the peace was short-lived. That afternoon, as Nick stepped out to take a call from his lawyer, a man approached Grace and Emma in the park. He was tall and sharply dressed, his presence instantly putting Grace on edge. Emma clung to her mother's hand, sensing the tension in the air. "Grace," the man said, his voice smooth but cold. "It's been a long time." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She recognized him immediately, Marcus Caldwell, one of Nick's father's former associates. His involvement in their lives years ago had been enough to drive her into hiding, and the sight of him now filled her with dread. "What do you want?" Grace demanded, keeping her tone steady despite the fear curling in her chest. Marcus smirked, his gaze flickering to Emma. Word travels fast, especially when someone like Nick Whitmore starts playing house with an old flame. "I'm here to remind you that certain arrangements are still in place." Grace's grip on Emma tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Marcus said, his smile widening. "Nick's father may be gone, but his legacy isn't. And neither is my interest in ensuring certain conditions are met." Before Grace could respond, Nick returned, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. He stepped between Grace and Marcus, his tone icy. "What are you doing here, Marcus?" "Just a friendly visit," Marcus replied, his demeanor unbothered. "Catching up on old times." Nick's jaw clenched. "Leave. Now." Marcus raised his hands in mock surrender, his smirk never fading. "I'll go, but this isn't over. You should know better than to ignore the past, Nick. It has a way of catching up." With that, Marcus turned and walked away, leaving an uneasy silence in his wake. Nick turned to Grace, his concern evident. "Are you okay?" Grace nodded, though her face was pale. "I'm fine. But Nick, I think this is far from over." Later that evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Nick and Grace sat in the dimly lit living room, the tension between them palpable. Grace explained everything she knew about Marcus and his ties to Nick's father, her voice trembling with frustration and fear. Nick listened intently, his mind racing with plans to protect them. "He's not going to get anywhere near you or Emma," he said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." Grace hesitated, her eyes searching his. "Nick, this isn't just about us anymore. Marcus is dangerous. He'll stop at nothing to get what he wants." Nick reached for her hand, his grip reassuring. "We'll handle this together," he said. "You're not alone anymore, Grace." For the first time in a long time, Grace allowed herself to believe him. But deep down, she knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy. Still, as Nick held her hand and promised to fight for their family, a small part of her dared to hope that they might come out of it stronger and finally free from the shadows of the past. Nick spent the next several days strategizing how to handle Marcus while balancing his growing bond with Emma and Grace. He knew he needed to act swiftly. Marcus wasn't the type to make idle threats, and his connection to Nick's late father meant he had both resources and motivation. Protecting Grace and Emma became Nick's singular focus, even as he wrestled with the guilt of how his past had spilled into their lives. Meanwhile, Emma remained blissfully unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. She continued to laugh, play, and chatter with Nick as though he had always been a part of her life. Every moment they spent together deepened his resolve to shield her from harm. She was the light in a world that had felt dark for far too long. Grace, however, couldn't shake the unease that lingered after Marcus's visit. She tried to hide her fear, but Nick could see it in the way she double-checked the locks at night or glanced over her shoulder during their walks. One evening, as they sat together in the living room after Emma had gone to bed, Nick decided to address it. "We're going to be okay," he said, his voice steady. "I won't let him hurt you or Emma." Grace sighed, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "Nick, you don't know what he's capable of." He was relentless back then, and I have no reason to believe he's changed. Nick leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers. Then we'll be relentless too. I've already spoken to my lawyer and a private investigator. We're going to dig into Marcus's activities and find something to stop him. He's not untouchable, Grace. Her gaze softened, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe him. I want to trust that, Nick. I really do. But I've spent so long running and hiding. It's hard to imagine a way out. Nick reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. You don't have to run anymore. We're in this together. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Grace's body tensed instantly, and Nick rose to answer it, motioning for her to stay back. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see Martha standing there, holding a folder under one arm and a determined expression on her face. I thought you might need some help, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Nick closed the door behind her, puzzled. Martha, what's going on? Martha placed the folder on the coffee table and turned to face them. I've been doing some digging of my own. I may not have a law degree or a private investigator's badge, but I've worked in your family long enough to know where the skeletons are buried. Nick exchanged a glance with Grace, who looked equally intrigued and skeptical. What did you find? He asked. Martha opened the folder, revealing a collection of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. Marcus wasn't just your father's associate. He was involved in some very shady dealings, money laundering, fraud, even blackmail. Your father kept records of everything, probably as leverage. I managed to get my hands on copies of a few things before the estate was settled. Nick's eyes widened as he scanned the contents of the folder. This is incredible. If we can verify this, it could be enough to take him down. Grace leaned closer, her curiosity overcoming her wariness. But why would Marcus still care about us now? It's been years. Martha nodded. I've been thinking about that. My guess is, with your father gone, Marcus sees an opportunity. He probably thinks he can use you, Nick, to regain some kind of influence or money. Nick clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. That's not going to happen. Martha placed a hand on his shoulder. Good, because I think we can turn the tables on him. But it's going to take careful planning. The three of them spent the next few hours going over the evidence Martha had brought and brainstorming their next steps. Grace remained quiet for much of the discussion, her emotions warring between hope and fear. When the plan was finally set, Nick walked Martha to the door, thanking her for her support. As he returned to the living room, he found Grace staring at the folder, her brow furrowed in thought. He sat down beside her, placing a gentle hand on her knee. We're going to get through this, Grace. I promise. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm scared, Nick. Not just of Marcus, but of what happens if this doesn't work. If he wins. Nick shook his head firmly. He won't win. He's underestimated us, Grace. And he has no idea how far I'm willing to go to protect you and Emma. Her lip trembled, and she reached out to wrap her arms around him, resting her head on his shoulder. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean on someone else, to trust that she didn't have to face everything alone. The next day, Nick put their plan into motion. He met with his lawyer and private investigator, providing them with the evidence Martha had uncovered and authorizing them to dig deeper. At the same time, he arranged for increased security around Grace's apartment, ensuring that Marcus wouldn't get close to her or Emma again. Grace, meanwhile, focused on maintaining a sense of normalcy for Emma. She took her to school, played games with her in the evenings, and did her best to keep the worry from showing on her face. But even as she smiled and laughed with her daughter, she couldn't shake the tension that coiled in her chest. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside, Nick returned to the apartment with good news. His investigator had uncovered additional evidence linking Marcus to a series of illegal activities, and they were preparing to present it to the authorities. Grace listened, her heart pounding. Do you think it will be enough? Nick nodded, his confidence unwavering. It will be. Marcus's time is running out. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt a flicker of hope. She reached out and took Nick's hand, holding it tightly. Thank you, she said quietly. For everything. Nick smiled, his eyes filled with determination. "We're a team, Grace, and we're going to win." The days that followed were a whirlwind of cautious anticipation. Nick worked tirelessly with his legal team and investigator to ensure the case against Marcus was airtight. He didn't want to leave any room for error, knowing how slippery Marcus could be. Every night, he returned to Grace and Emma's apartment, offering them reassurance and normalcy despite the storm brewing in the background. For Emma, life continued as usual, her days filled with school, play, and the simple joys of childhood. Nick marveled at how easily she had accepted him into her world. Her laughter and boundless curiosity were a constant reminder of what he was fighting for. It wasn't just about justice or redemption. It was about securing a future for her, one free from fear and uncertainty. Grace, however, couldn't shake the lingering unease. As much as she wanted to believe that Nick's efforts would be enough to stop Marcus, a lifetime of hardship had taught her to be wary. She found herself glancing out the window more often, double-checking the locks, and waking up in the middle of the night at the slightest sound. Nick noticed her tension, but chose not to push her, understanding that trust and comfort would come in their own time. One evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Nick and Grace sat together on the couch. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the heater. Grace cradled a mug of tea in her hands, her eyes fixed on a spot across the room. "You've been quiet tonight," Nick said, his voice gentle. "What's on your mind?" Grace hesitated before answering, her voice tinged with weariness. "I keep thinking about what happens next. Even if we stop Marcus, what does that mean for us? For you, me, and Emma?" Nick leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It means we get to move forward. Together." She shook her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "It's not that simple, Nick. You have a life, your businesses, your obligations. And we've been living in survival mode for so long. I don't know how to just be normal." Nick reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "We'll figure it out, Grace. One step at a time. I'm not going anywhere." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his for any hint of doubt. All she found was unwavering determination. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could truly change. The following morning, Nick received a call from his investigator with a breakthrough. They had uncovered a string of offshore accounts tied to Marcus, each one linked to fraudulent transactions and other illegal activities. The evidence was damning, enough to not only discredit Marcus, but also to launch a formal investigation against him. Nick felt a surge of relief, knowing they finally had the leverage they needed to end the threat. He immediately called Grace to share the news. Her voice, though cautious, held a note of optimism he hadn't heard before. "That's good, Nick. Really good." "It's more than good," he assured her. "This is it, Grace. We're going to be free of him." But just as the pieces were falling into place, Marcus made his move. That evening, as Nick was leaving his office, he received a text message that sent a chill down his spine. It was a photo of Grace and Emma walking to the park, followed by a message, "You're running out of time." Nick's hands shook as he called Grace, his voice urgent. "Where are you?" "We're at home," she said, confusion lacing her words. "What's wrong?" "Lock the doors," he said quickly. "I'm on my way. Don't let anyone in." Grace, sensing the fear in his tone, didn't question him. She hung up and immediately secured the apartment, her heart racing. Emma, sensing her mother's unease, asked, "What's wrong, Mommy?" "Nothing, sweetheart," Grace said, forcing a smile. "We're just being extra careful." Nick arrived minutes later, his expression grim. He explained the message to Grace, showing her the photo. Her face went pale as she realized just how closely Marcus had been watching them. "This ends now," Nick said firmly. "We have the evidence. I'm calling the authorities." The next few hours were a blur. Nick's legal team coordinated with law enforcement to file the charges against Marcus, and officers were dispatched to ensure Grace and Emma's safety. Nick stayed by Grace's side the entire time, his presence a steadying force as they navigated the chaos. By the time the dust settled, Marcus had been arrested. The authorities had raided his office and seized his records, uncovering even more evidence of his crimes. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt a weight lift from her chest. The man who had haunted her for so long was finally out of their lives. That night, as they sat together in the quiet apartment, Grace turned to Nick with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You saved us." Nick shook his head, his expression soft. "You don't have to thank me, Grace. I did what I should have done years ago. I'm just glad you're safe." Grace reached for his hand, her grip firm and sure. "We're safe because of you. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like we can breathe again." Nick smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "This is just the beginning, Grace. We've got a lot to look forward to." As Emma wandered into the room, rubbing her eyes sleepily, Nick scooped her up and held her close. "What's going on?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Nothing, sweetheart," Nick said softly. "Everything's okay now." As Grace watched them together, a sense of peace settled over her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope, not just for herself, but for Emma, and for the life they could build together. In the weeks that followed Marcus's arrest, life for Nick, Grace, and Emma began to settle into a new rhythm. The weight of fear that had loomed over Grace for so many years was finally gone, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of security. Emma continued to thrive, her laughter filling the apartment each day as she adjusted to having Nick in her life. For Nick, every moment with her felt like a gift, a chance to reclaim the time he had lost and to forge a bond he never thought possible. Nick remained a steady presence, showing up every morning to help Grace with Emma's school routine and staying late into the evenings to share dinner and stories by the fire. Grace, though still reserved at times, began to let her guard down, her trust in Nick growing as she saw the lengths he was willing to go to protect and support them. It wasn't just about the grand gestures, though there had been many. It was the small, thoughtful things he did each day that showed her his commitment. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, the three of them sat together decorating Christmas cookies. Emma was perched on a chair, her tongue poking out in concentration as she carefully added sprinkles to a tree-shaped cookie. Nick leaned over, guiding her hand with a steady patience that made Grace's heart ache with gratitude. "Why don't you try this one?" Nick suggested, holding up a cookie shaped like a star. "We could make it the brightest one on the plate." Emma's face lit up. "Can I use the gold sprinkles?" "Of course," Nick replied, sliding the jar toward her. "Gold is perfect for a star." As Emma busied herself with her creation, Grace watched them quietly, her hands resting in her lap. She hadn't realized how much she had missed moments like this, simple, peaceful moments that made her feel like part of a family. For so long, she had been in survival mode, focused solely on protecting Emma and keeping their lives stable. Now, for the first time, she felt like they were building something more. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Nick looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. "For what?" "For all of this," Grace said, gesturing to Emma and the cookies. "For being here. For staying." Nick reached across the table and took her hand, his expression serious. "You don't have to thank me, Grace. This is where I want to be." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'm starting to believe that." As Christmas drew nearer, Nick found himself wanting to do something special for Grace and Emma. He knew that their lives had been marked by struggle and hardship, and he wanted to give them a holiday that felt magical, a celebration of how far they had come and a glimpse of the life they could have together. With that goal in mind, he began to plan. The morning before Christmas Eve, Nick surprised Grace and Emma with a trip to a nearby tree farm. They bundled up in warm coats and scarves, Emma bouncing with excitement as they arrived at the farm, where rows of evergreens stretched as far as the eye could see. The crisp air was filled with the scent of pine and the sound of children laughing as families searched for the perfect tree. Emma ran ahead, her breath visible in the cold air as she darted between the trees. "This one's too small," she called out, pointing to a tiny sapling. "And this one's too big." Nick chuckled as he followed her, glancing back to make sure Grace was keeping up. She smiled at him, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "She's determined, isn't she?" "She gets it from you," Nick replied, earning a playful nudge from Grace. After much deliberation, Emma finally settled on a tall, full tree with branches that seemed to reach toward the sky. "This is the one," she declared, her eyes shining with excitement. Nick nodded in agreement. "It's perfect." They brought the tree home and spent the rest of the afternoon decorating it. Emma insisted on placing the gold-sprinkled star cookie she had made at the top, and Nick lifted her onto his shoulders so she could reach. Grace watched from the couch, her heart swelling as she took in the scene. It was the kind of moment she had dreamed of for Emma, a memory that she hoped her daughter would carry with her for the rest of her life. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Nick and Grace sat together in the living room, the glow of the Christmas tree casting soft light across the room. Grace sipped a cup of tea, her hands warm around the mug, while Nick leaned back on the couch, his eyes fixed on the tree. "It's beautiful," he said, breaking the silence. "You and Emma have created something really special here." Grace glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "So have you, Nick. You've given her so much joy these past few weeks." "And me too." Nick turned to her, his gaze steady. "That's all I've ever wanted, Grace. To give you both a life filled with love and happiness." Her heart ached at the sincerity in his voice, and she felt a surge of emotion that she couldn't quite put into words. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You've already given us more than I ever thought was possible." As Christmas morning dawned, Emma woke to find a small pile of presents under the tree, each one carefully chosen by Nick and Grace. The three of them spent the morning opening gifts, laughing, and sharing stories. Emma's favorite gift was a book of fairy tales, which Nick promised to read to her every night. As the day went on, Grace found herself reflecting on how far they had come. There were still challenges ahead, she knew, but for the first time, she felt like they had a real chance at building a future together. A future where Emma could grow up surrounded by love and stability. That evening, as they sat together by the fire, Emma curled up between them with her new book. Grace rested her head on Nick's shoulder. The snow fell softly outside, blanketing the city in a quiet peace. For the first time in years, Grace felt truly at home. Nick kissed the top of her head, his voice soft. "Merry Christmas, Grace." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Merry Christmas, Nick." And in that moment, surrounded by the people who mattered most, they both knew that they had found their way back to what truly mattered: family, love, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. As the new year approached, the Whitmore household began settling into a sense of normalcy that felt almost foreign to Grace. Days passed in a comforting rhythm, with Emma's boundless energy filling the apartment and Nick's steady presence grounding them both. For Grace, every moment was a reminder of how much her life had changed in such a short time. The fear and uncertainty that had once defined her existence were slowly being replaced by hope and trust. Nick, for his part, embraced his role as both father and partner with quiet determination. He had spent years focused on building his empire, but now he was learning to prioritize the small, meaningful moments. Helping Emma with her school projects, cooking dinner with Grace, and sitting together on the couch at the end of the day. These were the things he had once taken for granted, and he was determined not to let them slip away again. One evening, as the three of them sat around the kitchen table playing a board game, Emma leaned back in her chair and let out a happy sigh. "I like it when we're all together like this," she said, her voice light and carefree. Grace smiled, reaching over to tousle her daughter's hair. "Me too, sweetheart." Nick watched them, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and longing. He had spent so many years chasing success, only to realize that the life he truly wanted had been within reach all along. Now that he had it, he was determined to protect it. But even as they built their new life together, the shadows of the past lingered. The legal proceedings against Marcus were ongoing, and while the evidence was overwhelming, Nick couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't done causing trouble. Marcus had always been resourceful, and Nick knew better than to underestimate him. One afternoon, as Nick was leaving a meeting with his legal team, he received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was curt and professional. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Detective Harper. We've received some new information regarding Marcus Caldwell. We need you to come down to the station." Nick's stomach tightened. "Is there a problem?" "We'll explain everything when you get here." Nick arrived at the police station within the hour, his mind racing with possibilities. Detective Harper greeted him and led him to a small, windowless room. On the table was a folder filled with documents and photographs. Harper gestured for Nick to sit before speaking. "We've uncovered evidence that Marcus was working with others, people who were part of your father's inner circle," Harper explained. "They were involved in some of the same illegal activities, and it seems Marcus was leveraging that connection to shield himself. However, now that he's in custody, some of his associates are getting nervous. We believe one of them might try to retaliate." Nick frowned, the weight of the detective's words settling over him. Retaliate against whom? Harper's expression was grim. "You. Or Grace and Emma." The room seemed to tilt, and Nick gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. "What can we do to stop them?" he asked, his voice firm despite the fear rising in his chest. Harper slid the folder across the table. "We're working on building a case against the rest of the group, but it's going to take time. In the meantime, I suggest increasing security for your family. We'll assign officers to keep an eye on them, but I recommend hiring private security as well." Nick nodded, his jaw clenched. "I'll do whatever it takes." That evening, as Nick explained the situation to Grace, he could see the fear return to her eyes, the same fear that had haunted her for years. She sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Emma played quietly in her room, blissfully unaware of the danger. "I thought this was over," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nick sat beside her, his arm draping over her shoulders. "It will be," he promised. "We've already taken down Marcus, and we'll do the same with anyone else involved. I won't let them hurt you or Emma." Grace leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. "I want to believe that, Nick. I really do. But I'm so tired of living like this. Always looking over my shoulder. Always wondering when the next threat will come." Nick tightened his arm around her, his determination growing. "You won't have to live like this much longer. I'll make sure of it." The next few days were a flurry of activity as Nick implemented new security measures. He hired a private security team to monitor the apartment building and accompany Grace and Emma whenever they left the house. He also worked closely with the police to ensure that their home was as secure as possible. Grace initially balked at the level of precaution, but Nick's insistence won her over. "This is just until we know we're safe," he told her. "I need to know you and Emma are protected." Grace nodded, her resistance fading. "Okay," she said softly. "I trust you." Despite the heightened security, Nick made an effort to keep life as normal as possible for Emma. He continued to pick her up from school, help her with her homework, and play games with her in the evenings. He wanted her to feel safe and loved, even as they navigated the uncertainty of their situation. One evening, as they sat together watching a movie, Emma curled up beside Nick and looked up at him with a serious expression. "Are you going to stay with us forever?" she asked. Nick's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. He wrapped an arm around her and kissed the top of her head. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I promise." Grace, sitting across from them, watched the exchange with a mixture of gratitude and longing. She had spent so long protecting Emma on her own, and now, for the first time, she felt like she had a partner in Nick, someone who would stand beside her, no matter what. That night, as the snow fell softly outside, Grace and Nick sat together by the fire. Emma had fallen asleep in her room, her favorite stuffed animal clutched tightly in her arms. Grace rested her head on Nick's shoulder, her fingers intertwined with his. "I don't know how we got here," she said quietly, "but I'm glad we did." Nick kissed her forehead, his voice soft. "Me too." For the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to believe that their future could be brighter than their past. Together, they had faced the shadows that had threatened to tear them apart, and now, they were building something stronger. A family built on love, trust, and the promise of a better tomorrow. The weeks that followed brought a gradual easing of tension as the legal proceedings against Marcus's network moved forward. Nick's relentless efforts to ensure Grace and Emma's safety, combined with the constant presence of their security detail, gave them a measure of peace they hadn't experienced in years. The once constant weight of fear that had loomed over Grace began to fade, though it didn't disappear entirely. For Emma, life continued with the unshakable resilience of a child. She seemed to take the added security in stride, treating the watchful eyes of the guards as part of her normal routine. Her world revolved around school, friends, and the evenings spent with Nick and Grace. She thrived under the stability Nick had brought into their lives, her laughter filling the apartment with warmth. One chilly afternoon, as Nick walked Emma home from school, she glanced up at him, her mittened hand snugly held in his. "You're not like the other dads," she said matter-of-factly. Nick chuckled, glancing down at her. "What do you mean?" Emma tilted her head thoughtfully. "Well, you're kind of like a superhero. You're always around to help, and you make Mom smile a lot. Some dads just work all the time and don't play games or bake cookies." Nick smiled, her words tugging at his heart. "I'm glad you think that, Emma. You and your mom are the most important people in my life. I'll always do my best to make you both happy." Emma grinned up at him, her eyes sparkling. "You're pretty good at it so far." When they arrived home, Grace was waiting in the kitchen, a tray of steaming hot chocolate on the counter. The smell of cinnamon filled the air, and she looked up with a smile as they entered. Emma ran to her, shedding her coat and scarf as she launched into a rapid-fire recounting of her day. Grace listened with a warmth that made Nick's chest tighten. It was moments like this that he cherished, the simple, unguarded moments of family life. He watched Grace and Emma together, the bond between them as unshakable as it was beautiful. He wanted nothing more than to protect this, to ensure that their future was filled with more moments like these. Later that evening, as Emma lay asleep in her room, Nick and Grace sat together on the couch, the soft glow of the fire illuminating the room. Grace leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. For the first time in years, she seemed completely at ease. "You're really staying, aren't you?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying a mix of wonder and disbelief. Nick kissed the top of her head, his arm tightening around her. "I'm not going anywhere, Grace. I'm exactly where I want to be," she sighed contentedly, her fingers tracing absent patterns on his arm. "I still wake up sometimes, wondering if all of this is real. If I'll open my eyes and find myself back where we started, alone, afraid, and running." "You'll never have to go back to that," Nick said firmly. "Not as long as I'm here." Grace turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something deeper. "You've changed so much, Nick. You're not the same man I knew back then." Nick nodded, his expression serious. "I had to change. Losing you, and not knowing about Emma, was the hardest thing I've ever faced. It made me realize what really matters." Grace smiled softly, her hand brushing against his cheek. "Well, I think I like this version of you even better." Nick leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of them in the quiet warmth of the firelight. For the first time, Grace felt the last remnants of her walls begin to crumble, replaced by a trust she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. But as the days turned into weeks, life couldn't remain entirely idyllic. One evening, Nick received a call from his private investigator with an update that sent a chill through him. Though Marcus was securely behind bars, one of his associates, an ambitious and dangerous man named Victor Grayson, was still at large. Victor had been implicated in several of Marcus's schemes, and there were rumors that he was seeking revenge for Marcus's downfall. Nick shared the news with Grace, his tone calm but firm as he reassured her. "We're taking every precaution. The authorities are watching him closely, and so is our security team. He won't get anywhere near you or Emma." Grace nodded, though her face betrayed her lingering unease. "I trust you, Nick, but I just want this to be over. I want to feel safe again." Nick placed a hand over hers, his grip steady and reassuring. "We're almost there, Grace. Just a little longer." In the meantime, Nick doubled down on his efforts to ensure their safety. He coordinated with the security team, updated the apartment's surveillance system, and stayed in constant contact with the authorities. Every move he made was driven by his determination to protect Grace and Emma at all costs. Despite the tension simmering beneath the surface, Nick and Grace continued to build their life together. They celebrated Emma's small victories, from a school art project to her first successful attempt at baking cookies. They took long walks in the park, played games by the fire, and planned for the future. Each day brought them closer together, their bond deepening as they navigated the challenges that lay ahead. One evening, as the three of them sat together reading stories by the fire, Emma climbed onto Nick's lap and looked up at him with wide, earnest eyes. "Will you always stay with us?" she asked. Nick's heart ached at the vulnerability in her question. He wrapped his arms around her and kissed the top of her head. "Always, Emma. I promise." Grace watched them, her eyes glistening with emotion. She reached out, taking Nick's hand in hers. In that moment, she felt the last remnants of her fear begin to fade, replaced by the certainty that they could face anything as long as they were together. As the fire crackled softly in the background, the three of them sat together, wrapped in the warmth of their growing family. For the first time in years, Grace felt truly safe. And for the first time in his life, Nick felt whole. The final weeks of winter came with a quiet promise of change. The snow that blanketed the streets of New York began to melt, revealing patches of bare ground that hinted at the coming spring. For Nick, Grace, and Emma, it felt like the closing of a chapter. The legal proceedings against Marcus's associates were reaching their conclusion, and the threat that had hung over their lives for so long was finally dissipating. One crisp morning, Nick received a call from Detective Harper. Marcus's associate, Victor Grayson, had been apprehended overnight. The authorities had traced him to an abandoned warehouse where he'd been attempting to destroy evidence that tied him to Marcus's crimes. With his capture, the network that had once seemed so untouchable was effectively dismantled. When Nick shared the news with Grace, her relief was palpable. She sat down heavily at the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she let the weight of it sink in. "It's really over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nick knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "It's over," he confirmed, his tone filled with quiet certainty. "You and Emma are safe now." Tears filled Grace's eyes, but they weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of release, of finally letting go of the years she had spent looking over her shoulder. She wrapped her arms around Nick, holding him tightly as the realization washed over her. "Thank you," she murmured, "for everything." Nick held her just as tightly, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "You don't have to thank me, Grace. This is where I'm supposed to be." Over the next few days, life began to take on a new sense of normalcy. For the first time, Grace allowed herself to fully embrace the stability they had worked so hard to build. She stopped glancing out the window every time a car passed and started making plans for the future. Plans that included Nick. Emma, too, seemed to sense the shift. She was brighter, more carefree, as though the weight of her mother's worries had lifted from her small shoulders. She spent her days painting, reading, and dreaming up adventures, her laughter filling the apartment with a joy that felt contagious. One evening, as the three of them sat together at the dinner table, Emma looked up from her plate with a thoughtful expression. "Do families stay together forever?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Grace exchanged a glance with Nick, her heart swelling at the innocence of the question. "Sometimes families change, sweetheart," she said gently. "But the love we have for each other? That stays forever." Emma nodded thoughtfully, then turned her gaze to Nick. "So you're going to be with us forever, right?" Nick smiled, his heart aching with the weight of her words. "Forever," he promised. "No matter what." Grace reached over and placed her hand over his, her eyes shining with emotion. In that moment, she realized how far they had come. From a life of fear and uncertainty to a home filled with love and possibility. As the weeks turned into months, Nick and Grace began to weave their lives together in earnest. They made decisions as a team, from choosing a new school for Emma to discussing plans for the future. Grace started taking small steps toward pursuing her passion for art, encouraged by Nick's unwavering support. He even cleared out a corner of his home office to set up a small studio for her, complete with an easel and paints. For Nick, watching Grace rediscover herself was one of the greatest joys of his life. She had spent so long putting everyone else first, and he was determined to give her the space and support to chase her dreams. Every time he saw her lost in her work, a paintbrush in hand and a look of concentration on her face, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. One spring afternoon, as they walked together through the park, Nick stopped suddenly and turned to Grace. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over her face. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone careful but earnest, "about us, about what we've built together." Grace tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What about it?" Nick reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Grace's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a simple but elegant diamond ring. "I don't want to just be here for a while," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I want to be here forever. Grace, will you marry me?" For a moment, Grace was speechless. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them standing in the golden light of the afternoon. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him, her heart swelling with a mix of love and disbelief. "Yes," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Yes, Nick, I'll marry you." Emma, who had been chasing butterflies nearby, ran over just as Grace threw her arms around Nick. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Nick lifted her into his arms, his grin wide. "Your mom just said she'll marry me," he told her, his voice filled with joy. Emma's eyes widened with delight. "Does that mean you'll be my dad forever?" Nick kissed her cheek, his heart full. "It means I'll be your dad forever." As they walked home together, the three of them talked excitedly about the future, about weddings and new beginnings and the life they would build together. For Grace, it felt like the culmination of everything she had fought so hard for. A safe, loving home for her daughter, a partner who stood by her side, and a future filled with endless possibilities. That evening, as they sat together by the fire, Grace looked around the room and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had spent so many years surviving, but now, for the first time, she was truly living. And as she leaned into Nick's embrace, Emma curled up beside them with a book in hand. She knew that they had found something rare and precious. A family, a home, and a future they would face together, no matter what. Stories like this remind us of the incredible power of love, resilience, and second chances. What would you do if you had a chance to rebuild your family? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to stay tuned for more heartwarming stories on our channel. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video.